Are there prophecies in the most ancient surviving Egyptian texts, the Hermetic texts, that precisely describe the type of conditions that we see on earth today and give us insights into some sort of mass ascension event that will result from them? Also, did Solon, the wisest man of Greece, inherit prophecies from the Egyptian priesthood that quite literally describes a solar flash? And best of all, was this prophecy of ascension written into stone in the exact design and construction and masonry of the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt? These are some of the fascinating questions that we will answer in this episode. The subject of Egyptian prophecy has gotten really interesting since the 1990s with the advent of the scholarship of Robert Bauval, John Anthony West, and Graham Hancock, all of whom, by the way, I have interviewed, and you can watch those interviews in our other show that I was in here on Gaia called Disclosure. I highly recommend that as a context for what I'm about to discuss right now, because I was there when that Robert Bauval book came out called The Orion Mystery that changed everything, where he presented a hypothesis about the idea that the three pyramids of Egypt, the central focus of everything, were in fact in the same positions, and their sizes correspond to the magnitudes of the three stars in the belt of the constellation Orion. And what's interesting about this is not just that the sizes correspond to the magnitudes and that their weird offset positioning corresponds to the locations of those stars. It also has to do with the fact that the Nile River corresponds to the location of the Milky Way, and that the position of this area on the ground, particular time on Earth, based on this precession of the equinoxes. And that time appears to be approximately, again, about 12,000 years ago, maybe 11,400 years ago, something like this. This may very well be the accurate time-encoded prophecy that goes backwards to tell us when these events that they call Zep-Tepi, or the first time, took place. That corresponds beautifully with the Edgar Cayce readings, which actually stated that the pyramid was built between 11,490 to 11,390 years before the present. So there's a really interesting speculation that we can go into here about what that Zep-Tepi meant. What was that time where these gods were walking on earth? Because the Egyptian hieroglyphics and the paintings that we have surviving are clearly describing a host of unusual beings. We have the Hathors, these beings that have ears that come off the sides of their head. They look like cow ears, for example. We also have this character named Set, who has a bird-like head that looks like an ibis. And now what's attracted considerable interest was the work of William Henry that we debuted on Cosmic Disclosure, where he showed us that there are surviving images of Horus, the hawk-headed god, where he is clearly shown as a blue avian. This was something that we did not know when Corey Goode started to be contacted by bird-like humanoids that had this 8-foot-tall appearance and feathers instead of skin, large eyes. It now looks very much like these beings keep appearing. We see them as the Tengu birdmen of the mountains in Japan. Again, they're blue-colored, and they're humans with a bird-like face. So this also corresponds very nicely with the source text that I believe is the most important revealed teaching in modern times. It's something I've based most of my life's work on, called the Law of One series, approximately 126 question and answer sessions between an alleged extraterrestrial intelligence and a PhD physics professor that took place predominantly from 1981 through 1983, and most of it in 1981. There's so many scientific data points in that book, that series of 5 books actually, well over 100, so specific that I had to go look them up and find data that proved them that didn't even exist when the words were first said. And so in the Law of One, they explain that they did contact the Egyptians, and the time window of when they did it was exactly the same as what we see in the Giza alignment and what we see in the Casey readings, namely about 12,000 years ago. Then we find out from Corey that these blue avians are in fact the same beings that gave us the law of one. Everything connects together so beautifully. They're back again now. And one of the oldest surviving teachings from that original Egyptian inheritance is called the Hermetic texts. These texts are considered very ancient even by anybody's standards. And according to Graham Hancock, it's probably the best surviving example of actual written language that we have from that time. And remember, there's weird stuff about Egypt. The first pharaoh, Osiris, is shown as having a greenish-colored skin and an elongated skull. We have the Osirion built near the Sphinx, which is this whole temple made out of gigantic blocks of stone, megalithic. And those blocks of stone still lithic. And those blocks of stone still couldn't be moved with the cranes that we have today. The Sphinx now, according to John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, the geologist, and others, appears to have water weathering at the rear end. You look back there and you see these smooth curves suggesting that erosion took place from water. And that again dates it back 10,000 years plus. So everything that we thought we knew about Egypt is wrong, and this new view is looking to be accurate. So this text, these Hermetic texts, could very well be something that were written before the fall of what we call Atlantis, and Egypt was one of those civilizations. So this makes it very significant for us to read now because it's literally one of the oldest ones we have. Let's take a look at it. This text that we're going to be reading from is called Asclepius's Lament. It is one of the Hermetic texts, and you're going to see here a little bit of speculation on the dating of the text as quoted from the book Thrice Greatest Hermes by G.R.S. Mead in 1906, where it says, "It is impossible to base upon it any certain conclusions as to the date of the original, nor its precise worth in the history of religion," meaning that it is priceless in the history of religion. It's actually of extreme significance. That, however, our Latin translation is an ancient one is proved by Augustine's verbal quotations from it. So St. Augustine was quoting from these texts, and he was one of those guys who came out shortly after Christ, but he's already referring to these documents as being extremely ancient, which we're going to read in this next quote from Thrice Greatest Hermes. It was thus in existence about 400 AD at least. Tradition, however, has assigned to it a far higher antiquity. So, this lament, we kind of run into trouble because none of the translations are totally modern in the sense that some of them have very odd words that we're not familiar with. Some of the languaging seems to be archaic, but the two best sets of translations are from Copenhagen and Scott. And so what happened is Graham Hancock, in some really legendary work, integrated those two translations together. He didn't add anything, he didn't take anything away. He just took the most sensible parts of both translations, line by line, integrated them together into what is a truly user-friendly version of Asclepius's Lament. And before we start reading it, I want to point something out. When we were talking about the Hindu prophecies, we mentioned how there is this astonishing prophetic insight into what our world today was going to look like, told by people who were at that time that was essentially like a golden age, where they had ascended abilities, they had amazing magic powers, they were very pious, very spiritual, totally centered in that higher fourth dimensional reality. And yet they're looking at a time of great darkness, what they call Kali Yuga. And it's interesting because Egypt is a totally isolated, separate culture from India. And yet, in these texts, once again, we have astonishing prophecies of exactly what the world was going to look like today. And if you can follow the logic, this could very well have been written by the Blue Avians as they appeared back then, in the forms that were then depicted on this cave art. That's how ancient these texts might be. So getting a really good translation, as Hancock has done, is paramount to understanding what we were actually told. Now let's get in there. There will come a time from earth to heaven. Now, I am shortening it a little bit here because if I read you the whole thing, it would probably take longer than one episode. But look at that. The gods will return from earth to heaven, meaning that the ETs that were here on earth, these avian humanoids and the Hathors and beings that look like Set and beings maybe with elongated skulls, if not all of them are bad, they depart from the earth. They return to heaven. And again, heaven in many translations means outer space. So something has happened where spiritual people are not getting rewarded. The ETs are no longer on earth. It's just humans. And at that time that this was written, they had ETs on earth. They called them gods, but they knew that they would not be here at the end of the age. This is really interesting. Let's keep reading. O Egypt, Egypt, of thy religion nothing will remain, but an empty tale. Only the stones will tell of thy piety. Now this is interesting because Graham Hancock reports that the oldest Egyptian teachings describe that the ascension process involves having your heart weighed against a feather. And it's only if the feather weighs more than your heart that you're ready to go through this transformation to the next level. That's a teaching about love, about service to others, about not having a heavy heart, not being an angry, judgmental, depressed, bully type of person, but actually being inspired and having that uplifting feeling. And the Law of One also reports that the original 12,000-year-old teachings given to Egypt were extremely positive, but that over time the priesthood distorted the message and contorted it from its original positive intent. And it says, only the stones will tell of thy piety, meaning that the pyramids, to some degree, are the last resort that shows that there was once a great spiritual culture that fell into ruin. Now let's continue. And in that day, meaning our time, last resort that shows that there was once a great spiritual culture that fell into ruin. Now let's continue. And in that day, meaning our time right now, men will be weary of life, and they will cease to think the universe is worthy of reverent wonder and worship. And so religion, the greatest of all blessings, will be threatened with destruction. Men will think it a burden and will come to scorn it. Well, this definitely is what's going on now. And spirituality does have a certain degree of renaissance taking place. And as Richard C. Hoagland would say, the good are getting better, the bad are getting worse. That's all true, but there's a pervasive negativity on this planet. There is a real sarcastic cynicism about anything having to do with spirituality. Whereas this was written in a culture where spirituality was widely practiced and considered so obvious that it would be ridiculous to doubt the idea that we have a soul. Let's keep reading. As for the soul and the belief that it is immortal by nature, or that you may hope to attain immortality as I have taught you, all this they will mock, and even persuade themselves that it is false. That is absolutely what is happening right now. It totally fits with the prophecies for our present time. The gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing. Only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men. This is sounding pretty darn familiar. And drive the poor wretches into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds, and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. That really is sounding very familiar, because we've talked about Draco, we've talked about how the Draco are influencing the Cabal on Earth, and the Cabal is very actively trying to drive us into vices, into being violent, into having morality, to buy more, to be more depressed, to be dependent on them. All this stuff creating a slave race type of mentality, far from what was going on at the time this was originally written. And remember, this prophecy was already known to exist and be ancient by 400 AD, so nobody can possibly dispute that. Let's keep reading. This is where the earth change part starts to happen. This has not really occurred yet, but we're getting near it. Then will the earth tremble, and the sea will bear no ships. Heaven will not support the stars in their orbits. Now this obviously, right there, is talking about some kind of pole shift. It's talking about that the stars will not be supported in their orbits. There's some sort of movement where the earth is trembling and the sea won't bear ships because the ships are sinking from all the turbulence in the ocean. That's what this is talking about. And again, this is not something that everybody goes through. As it says in Law of One, it's only the people who have authorized that they need a big karmic payout, like people who are involved in the most depraved acts of negative behavior, evil behavior, as we're now starting to learn that may be happening in the levels of government. Those types of people are the ones who are going to go through this. It's very unlikely that anybody else will. But the prophecy puts it on the dot that here you have these earth change events taking place. Let's keep reading. All the voices of the gods will be forced into silence, and that definitely is the case. Nobody really knows what the ETs are saying. It's not like they're showing up. It's not like we have any real way to know exactly what's going on. We only get little bits and pieces of information. We have to kind of make our own conclusions. Let's continue. The fruits of the earth will rot. This is about droughts and that kind of thing. The soil will turn barren, and the very air will sicken with sullen stagnation. Will turn barren, and the very air will sicken with sullen stagnation. All things will be disordered and awry. All good will disappear. Sounds pretty bleak, but that's how they look at it where we are now from where they were. But when all of this has befallen Asclepius, then God, the creator of all things, will call back to the right path those who have gone astray. He will cleanse the world of evil, washing it away with floods, burning it out with the fiercest fire, and expelling it with war and pestilence. Now this is interesting because the burning out with the fiercest fire is a reference to the solar flash. It is the fire from the sun. This fiery release of energy from the sun, which does create what is a purifying type of experience, where, again, there's a cosmic rescue plan. You don't go through this in physical form. You get rescued unless you're a really wicked person. But in the process of this rescue plan, you're also going through an ascension, some kind of transformation of what it actually means to be human. That's the underlying nature of what these prophecies are saying. It's really fascinating. So let's keep going. And thus will the Creator bring back this world to its former aspect, so that the cosmos will once more be deemed worthy of worship and wondering reverence. Such is the new birth of the cosmos. It is a making again of all things good, a holy and awe-inspiring restoration of all nature, and it is wrought inside the process of time by the eternal will of the Creator. So isn't this interesting? A holy and awe-inspiring restoration of all nature. That really does correspond with what everybody else is saying. All these references in the Hindu text to the Samvardhaka fire, to the idea of a Kalki avatar coming through, to the idea that there are 8 superhuman faculties, that there are multiple beings in this entourage, that evil is defeated, there's some sort of flash of energy that comes out of the sun, it has wreaths of lightning in the clouds, it has rainbows in the sky, and we're activated into some Krita or Satya Yuga, some golden age, where we have this newly perfected body. We looked at Zoroastrianism, it's the same thing, the future body, the perfected body that comes about through the efforts of good people bringing about this change where all these messianic beings arrive, they defeat the bad guys, and there is some sort of energetic emission that they call molten metal. And if you're a good person, it feels like warm milk. If you're an evil person, you get burned by it. Now we have this Egyptian prophecy saying the same thing, an awe-inspiring restoration of all nature involving the burning of fierce fire, and it says it's wrought inside the process of time. And I really geeked out on that statement in my first book, Source Field Investigations, because I believe the process of time is like a bunch of gears. Imagine now that you're looking at the interior of a watch, and you're watching these gears spinning. And you see that some gears are smaller and they spin much faster. Other gears are larger and they spin slower. What if the cycles of time actually work this way? What if there are cycles within cycles and they are all interdependent upon one another? And what if this 25,920 year cycle would be like the master gear that spins everything else? And it takes 25,920 years for all of this to complete itself. Wouldn't that be a good analogy to call it the process of time? And isn't it interesting that they say at the end of this process of time, is this awe-inspiring restoration to a much more recent text that comes our way not from the Egyptians directly, but from the Greeks through none other than Plato, who actually wrote the Timaeus and Critias based upon the testimony of Solon, the wisest man in all of Greece, who was lucky enough to get direct entrance into the Egyptian priesthood. Now, I want to be clear on something. The Law of One does state that the Egyptian priesthood had fallen into disrepute. These beings with the elongated skulls that were there in Egypt are the pre-Adamites. They are the precursors to the Cabal. They merged with Rome when Rome invaded and overtook Egypt. So what we have is a surviving text from Plato, the Timaeus and Critias, based upon the testimony of Solon, who was the wisest man in Greece, and Solon was able to gain entry into the Egyptian priesthood in order to hear their highest level teachings. Now, I want to be clear on something. The Egyptian priesthood were pre-Adamites. They had the elongated skulls, and the Law of One material says that they had fallen far astray from their original positive teachings, including the fact that they were apparently practicing human sacrifices. The Romans invaded Egypt, absorbed that pre-Adamite culture, took the Library of Alexandria, brought it in the Vatican Library. These guys in the Vatican have the mitre hats concealing the elongated skulls because some of those people in the Egyptian priestly caste with elongated skulls were still around. And so don't necessarily think that everything Egyptian is good. The Egyptian priesthood had gotten negative, and I believe that when you hear this prophecy from them as told to Solon, you're hearing a perspective on this solar flash from those who actually do not make it into Ascension, but are very concerned about what's going to happen. Let's take a look. Into Ascension, but are very concerned about what's going to happen. Let's take a look. After the usual interval, that's the 25,000-year cycle, the stream from heaven, like a pestilence, comes pouring down. This is your solar flash. This event leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education. And so you have to begin all over again like children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among yourselves. So this is clearly describing a stream of heaven that comes pouring down. Notice the similarity to the idea of molten metal, rivers of molten metal that come pouring down. It's the same idea. The stream, it's even described as a liquid type of thing. And then it says you have to begin again like children. This would be the perspective from pre-Adamites who survived one of these, but did not ascend at all. They just had to tough it out and go through very horrible survival type of conditions in order to build themselves back up, and they lose their letters, they lose education, they don't know where they came from anymore. Only a small amount of their knowledge survives. But there's more to hear, so let's keep reading. As for those genealogies of yours, which you just now recounted to us, Solon, they are no better than the tales of children. This requires a little explanation because Solon was trying to brag and show off by describing genealogies, meaning lists of kings and how far back he knew this king's name, and then this king begat this king, and this king begat so on and so on and so on. And the Egyptian priesthood basically just laughs in his face and says, your knowledge is literally no better than that of a child. Let's see what else he says. In the first place, you remember a single flood or deluge only, but there were many previous ones. In the next place, you do not know that there formerly dwelt something that was very advanced, something that got totally wiped out by this big flood and solar flash type of event, which is likely what happened during that flood as well. And it's all coming back together with the insider testimony that we have now, including the idea of the Antarctic Atlantis, where these pre-Adamites supposedly crash landed because there was some really good stuff they needed in Antarctica, namely ancient builder race ruins that they accessed that were underground. But let's keep reading for now. And that you and your whole city are descendants from a small seed or remnant of them which survived. And this was unknown to you, because for many generations the survivors of that destruction died and left no written word. Now, last but not least, I want to give you just a little bit of an insight into the Great Pyramid. There's going to be a huge section in future parts of this show where we go through the global geometric grid, how all of these different pyramids and stoneworks around the world, 3,300 of them in total, are on this grid. And when we get there, we're going to have a really cool thing where we go into great detail about the Great Pyramid. But remember, Asclepius's lament said, only the stones will tell of thy piety. It's just going to be a record in stone. So we have the Great Pyramid, and here is your seal on the obverse side of the Great Seal of the United States, which clearly has the pyramid with the all-seeing eye at the top. Now this is very interesting because it does suggest powerful esoteric knowledge. Look at this symbol for a second and think about the idea that in fact the pyramid as it exists now does have a flat top. This is very important because in Egyptian numerology you want to count the base, the top, and the four sides to get the number 6. And the number 6 in Egyptian numerology has a very specific meaning. It means imperfection and evil. To get the number 6, and the number 6 in Egyptian numerology has a very specific meaning. It means imperfection and evil. So once you put a capstone on top of the pyramid, you no longer have a side on the top. You no longer have flatness. You just have four sides that go up to a point and it terminates. That means that you've gone from an object with 6 sides to an object that now only has 5. And the 5 number in Egyptian numerology means divinity and perfection, a very different meaning. It is the transmutation of humanity on earth. We've talked at length about the idea that the all-seeing eye is the third eye, like the pineal gland in the brain. And I'm going to have a whole big thing on the pineal gland in future episodes as well. And the idea that there's some sort of pineal activation that gives us these ascended abilities, activating this stargate in our brain. I've also speculated that the all-seeing eye may literally represent the solar flash itself, the eye of God, if you will. Because remember, in the Hindu texts, it describes that the Samvartaka fire is the body, the essence of the Creator. It's not just light, it's not just energy, it's actually intelligence. It's divinity. And the other thing, just to give you a little brief glimpse of what's going on with the pyramid, is that when you go into the king's chamber, you see this granite sarcophagus. And the granite sarcophagus originally was very precisely geometric, only now when you go in there, a lot of people chipped off pieces from it, so there's a whole side of it that has been worn off. One of the corners has been worn off. But this is interesting because that sarcophagus does not have a lid, and there's nothing in it. So this is a very powerful symbolic message, similar to the missing capstone, which when it gets put on, the pyramid is perfected and it goes from a 6 to a 5. The idea of an opening that does not have any ability to die. We are immortal beings. That is the presumed meaning of this. And lastly, as I said in the Ascension mysteries, there is a stunning complementarity between the exact dimensions of the granite sarcophagus inside this king's chamber and the Ark of the Covenant as explained in the Old Testament. The exact measurements are the same. Now, why do I think that's significant? It's because the pyramid was sealed off. There was no way to get into the king's chamber. It wasn't until Caliph al-Mamun broke in there in the mid-800s AD that we started to know what we were actually going to find inside. So how the heck could they have known this in the Old Testament? This again suggests that the same people who built the pyramid came back to make corrections after their original religion had gotten totally damaged by the Egyptian priesthood. And they left that as a calling card to make a linkage point between what they were now doing and what they tried to do before. These are just some of the many amazing, amazing things that show the pyramid as being a direct prophecy of a mass ascension event, and that is coming up in later episodes. The thing I want you to take away from in this episode is the idea that we have the Hermetic texts describing an awe-inspiring restoration of all nature. We have the Egyptian priesthood describing a clear type of solar flash, and we also have the pyramid, which definitely appears to be giving us some sort of ascension prophecy that even was so important that it was put right onto the dollar bill. When we come back, there's going to be a lot more about these ascension prophecies in the Greek and the Roman culture, and it does involve the solar flash very directly. It's quite exciting. All right, that's all the time we have for in this episode. It's really fascinating stuff, especially when you see a prophecy in stone. I'm David Wilcock, bringing you the information you need to know that will set you free. Thanks for watching.